Olá, olá a todos, bem-vindos a mais um podcast. Vamos ter um ilustre convidado, é um prazer ter como convidado Jean Paul Hoppner. Estou a tentar dizer o nome, não sei, não consigo dizer bem o nome, mas Jean Paul Hoppner, osteopata, DO, é escritor, é docente, é palestrante em anatomia, embriologia e também em prática clínica osteopática também ensina. Faz parte de um projeto morfológico, o Morfologicum. O projeto está, a referência para o website está depois na descrição do vídeo, na descrição quando partilhamos nas redes sociais e no YouTube. Tem um link para esta escola e também para o livro do Jean Paul. Este Morfologicum é um projeto de ensino, é uma escola de ensino para osteopatas com o objetivo de manter viva as raízes e os fundamentos da osteopatia. O título do podcast, A Vida como um Verbo. Em busca da origem e da natureza do ser humano. Basicamente, Life as a Verb in Search of Origin and Nature of the Human Being. É o título do podcast, basicamente é o título do livro mais recente do Jean Paul, que tem exatamente este título. And thank you, Jean Paul, for accepting the invitation. I've been following you on LinkedIn and other networks, social networks, for quite a while. And I really enjoy some of your presentations, and the ones I saw. There's not so much things on LinkedIn. It's basically things that you write, and not so much things like as a video, but mainly texts that you write, and I really enjoy them. And they take a deep dive into embryology, into morphogenesis, into ontogenesis and stuff like this, and to understand the development of the human being. And that's I really enjoy reading your thing. So thank you so much for accepting the invitation. And my first question is just a small introduction to the first question. It's very simple. It's since I start reading you, it's very clear for me the deepening of ideas, like trying to truly understand the form and function. I mean, since the beginning of osteopathy and since the beginning of academic studies throughout the years, this ideas of form and function, function and form, interdependent, related. It's very much alive. It's taught to students since the first year. This form and function. So you take a dive into a deepening in the ideas and trying to understand this form and function in the different dimensions of the human being. So you bring to the table in your talks and in your writing what I said: ontogenesis, morphogenesis, embryology, to explain patterns of function. And I know these names, ontogenesis, embryology, are not really names that are very familiar to most of people. So it's a very it's like a ride and a search and a travel right to the beginnings of life, human life. And then so the book Life as a Verb in Search of the Origin and Nature of human being reveals this beginning of life and its morphokinetics. You actually have a lecture, several lectures on morphokinetics and dysfunctional patterns. So my first question is, what compelled you to write this book? What's the most important message you want to bring to osteopaths in general and manuotherapists out there with this book?
Well, as so often in osteopathy, if you look into the philosophy of osteopathy, a lot should be seen in a context, in the environmental conditions of what is happening, how this form and how this function looks alike. So in fact, if you want to come to the book, why the book and how the book, I have to go back very, very far back in time to somewhere the age of 14 years old. I mean, it goes that far back. It was the moment when I studied Latin, sciences, and mathematics at school, and I had a biology teacher, and she was quite special because it was her idea that you can't teach students something, they can only teach themselves something. And they can only teach themselves something when they do it themselves. And one fine day, she made us dissect a rabbit a chicken, and a fish in order to study the digestive system. And at that young age, I discovered for myself a complete new world. I mean, I was a so-called city boy, so to speak, not really, but dissecting animals, for instance, was new to me. This was the starting point for myself to become intrigued by anatomy. And so at the age of 18, I decided I want to study anatomy. I want to study the human form, how it looks like, and how it functions, already at that age. So I began my medical studies because that was the only possibility in those days to study anatomy. But in the next coming 2 years, I became quite, let's say, frustrated because it was not much about anatomy. So I changed my course. I changed my course several times because every time, again, I was more or less frustrated. And this is how I ended up with osteopathy. Not because I wanted to become or wanted to be an osteopath, so to speak. I became an osteopath because I began to study osteopathy, not for osteopathy itself, but for the fact that osteopathy is anatomy, anatomy, and again anatomy. And this also was for me an opening door into the philosophy of osteopathy. Now, people who know me quite well, and certainly my wife, for instance, they know me as the guy, why? Always a question, why? Okay, why does it look like this? Okay, I can take it apart to understand what are the parts that make it look like that. But also the question, where does it come from? Where do these bones come from? Where do these muscles come from? Where do these fascias, blood vessels, nerves, where do they all come from? So quite soon in my studies, and now I talk about the years 82, 83, so 1982, 1983. Yes, I am an old man, so to speak.
You look
I
very
also
good.
came to the conclusion I have to study embryology. Yeah. But when I continued studying embryology, the questions were not answered. This is very important because the approach of common daily known embryology is about mainly chemistry. Okay, the DNA model here is standing in front of everything. They try to explain everything where it comes from by using the chemical road, DNA induced. And then in the mid-80s, I stumbled over a book of a German professor, Professor Blechschmidt, and he uses a complete different approach. Yeah, he uses not a chemical, he uses a physical approach. And this for me was an eye-opener because for the very first time, I got a large number of answers to my questions and they made sense. Yeah. And diving into osteopathy, diving into the philosophy of osteopathy, diving into also the philosophy of Blechschmidt, which is not so much really Blechschmidt's philosophy because there are two other persons who came up with the idea at the end of the 19th century. It was Gurwitsch and Driesch. So he lended it, so to speak. But anyhow, diving into the philosophy of still and that what was used by Blechschmidt, I came to the conclusion they talk about the same. Yeah, they use maybe other words, but they talk about the principles of nature. And this is how I began to understand, well, for instance, if we look at form as such, okay, then to understand form, you always need another dimension to that form, which is the structural dimension underneath. So you have a human, but a human is made out of organs. So to understand the human form, you need the knowledge of the human organs. And to understand the form of these organs, you need the knowledge of these tissues that make the organ, and so on, and so on, and so on. Which means in the end, I studied not only anatomy, I also studied histology, I also studied cytology, I also studied biochemistry to go as far as possible to understand why a form looks like this and not different. Now, somewhere in, I think, 97, 98, somebody told me while I was teaching at the college in Germany and Belgium and Netherlands, somebody said to me, well, you teach that, but please write it down. I said, why should I write it down? Well, this is quite unique, they said, because this is a red line from the very earliest beginning. Yeah, you start with energy, you go to matter, you go from matter to molecules, from molecules to cells, from cells to tissues, from tissues to organs, from organs to organism. This is a complete red line without any, so to speak, gaps in it. It's one continuous line. You can follow it. It's logical and it's based on really natural principles. So please write it down so that it doesn't go, that does not get lost. I made several attempts, but it was always quite difficult. Somehow I didn't succeed, mainly I think because I didn't have that much time in those days. I was quite a lot on the road, teaching in different countries, having my own practice here, having a family with 3 children, and so on and so on. So it was not until I think 2018 somewhere where I met this lady, Joanna Wildy from London, an osteopath, and she took a class with me, a course, and we got into talk, and she said, well, again, why don't you write it down? I said, well, Joanna, I tried several times, but I couldn't manage it till now. And it was she, in fact, who gave me then some tips. You could do it like this, you could do it like that. And so I began to write some pages. I gave it to her. She said, it looks very promising. This is a way you can use it. But still, I had not enough time for that. But then came, of course, unfortunately for most people, but happily for me, came Corona. I was locked up for 2.5 years almost because we were not allowed to travel, not allowed to work as we used to. And so I spent my time, most of the time, in writing the book eventually and making all the drawings. So my intention is, in fact, to deliver for young osteopaths a red line into the understanding of form and function all along all the dimensions. And I think for osteopaths, certainly for osteopaths, it's very important. Why? If you look into the literature of Andrew Taylor Still, and you take, for instance, Philosophy of Osteopathy, the red book, okay, and you go to page, I don't know, 16, 17 or 17, 18, somewhere around that pages. He says, what do I mean by what do I mean by anatomy? Because this is very important. Most osteopaths, certainly nowadays, the younger generation, and this should not be a critic, it's just a question of what you notice every day now, is that you see when they hear the word anatomy, they think of the dimension of Andreas Vesalius, yeah, musculus sartorius, vertebra lumbalis, the stomach, the liver. That is the dimension they're thinking, which is not bad, which is not wrong. Don't get me wrong. But if you look into the book, for instance, of Still, Philosophy of Osteopathy, he says, what do I mean by anatomy? And there he says, what I mean is, indeed, I mean the anatomy of Vesalius and all the other anatomists, but he also talks of the importance of histology, and he talks about the importance of cytology, and he talks even of the importance of chemistry. So he mentions all these dimensions of human being, yeah, because we are nothing without chemicals, we are nothing without molecules, we are nothing without cells, we are nothing without tissues, we are more than only organs. So for osteopaths, this book, I think, is maybe a little bit back an eye-opener that to the form and the function of the human being, yeah, there's more than one dimension, the dimension of the macroscopic structures. So therefore, the red line. And then, of course, there was the question about what title am I going to use? How will I title this book? And you mentioned a little bit already, morphokinetics, morphodynamics, and so on. But I wanted something else. I wanted to have more behind it. And then if you see, I was trained in school, in high school, with Latin, rhetorics, and the meaning of words and the meaning of sentences. So I give it a good thought. And then you see very often in conversations, life is described like a chair, a table, whatever, something, a noun. Yeah. But for me, life is not a noun. For me, life is a verb. meaning life is a phenomenon, meaning life is full of changes of what? Of form. Yeah, so in fact the human form is constantly under influence of environment and constantly changing from the very first cell that becomes fertilized up until the day that you end and even beyond. And that is what I wanted to bring in the book. That is why I chose the title Life as a Verb, meaning it is a phenomenon. Yeah, it is characterized by changes. And I want also to give an insight to the reader, for the reader, of how and for also why. What are the circumstances that this form is going to become changed? And I think for osteopaths, it gives you a possibility and a door that opens possibilities to understand when a patient comes to you, okay, that this patient is characterized not only by his form or her form, but also by a very specific environment which he has to deal with. So this was a little bit the background idea, yeah, which I was working with since the day, like I said, that day when I was 14 years old and in secondary school in that biology class. That was the starting point, and look at how it ended. 480 pages of gathered information, yeah, in one book.
And it's fascinating because it's almost like you can see a I don't want to say completion because life is never complete until we die, but it's almost like a circle where the circle of life is almost like, because life as a verb, as you say it means, you know, this dynamics of life. Everything is evolving and changing and transforming and adapting, and just, so it's very dynamic in this, and it really, life describes this state of being that is constantly changing, you know, and almost it started when you were 14, and then you know, somehow it brought you to this point where you write this important stuff, this very important food for thought. And yeah, I don't think universities in for osteopathy courses, I don't think they teach enough embryology and morphology and morphogenesis, and I think, because, you know, I remember decades ago, like this idea of even referred pain, or understanding how, for instance, mesoderm, what comes out from ectoderm or ectodermis or mesodermis, and then kind of explains patterns of referent pain, or you know. And I remember like decades ago, people like talking about, you know, mobilizing the collarbone for diaphragm issues and stuff like this, or whatever. I don't remember specifics. So it definitely gives an insight of understanding better, you know, this live organism, and how, you know, and understanding the chemistry, even the chemistry, because if we look into the chemistry, there's the chemistry in the central nervous system is kind of the same than peripheral nervous system, and also the way hormones act both internally and the central nervous system and outside of it, and the tissues. You can see this pool of hormones and neurotransmitters and other chemicals. They're very much they're all in the same pool. They're all coming from the same kind of places and interacting in different ways. So I would say it's very, very important for many reasons. But basically, to understand better the function and the dysfunction, if we understand better the function, the dysfunction, and stuff like pain or movement, I would say it's very, very very important. And my question is, I even thought of people like well, the first name that comes to mind is a doctor, I think it's Michael Levin or Levine, which is a guy that's basically nowadays is a postdoc, is basically is changing the form of cells by changing their membrane, basically changing the protons and you know, ion channels, changing out of place and you know, twitching a little bit with the cell membrane. And what they're discovering is by changing the form of the membrane, it changes the function also of the cell. So a cell that is programmed, let's say, to develop a limb can be, by changing its form, can be starting to develop a head, for instance. So they're doing amazing, fascinating work in this morphogenesis, if you want, in changing the function of the cell, not by changing its DNA, not by changing its nuclei, but changing the form, and how the membrane interacts with the environment, external environment, and how does that interferes with the core, with the nuclei and DNA replication and all of that. So it's just fascinating. I wonder if because the knowledge back in 19th century was not enough in this matters, but I wonder if
Well,
you
I
have.
wouldn't agree there. Well, I would not say that.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that because and even more. No, I don't agree with that. For the simple reason, when you look into the work of Still and what he wrote, when you look into the work of Drisch and Gurwitch, the founders, the intellectual fathers of morphokinetics, and if you look into the philosophy, the way how that Blechschmidt used that, applied it on the human embryo, what was quite soon, very early, quite clear for me is that when Still talks about form and function in the context of osteopathy, when Blechschmidt talks about form and function in the context of human form, human development, what struck me the most is the fact, this is I hope that really comes to the front also in the book. I took a lot of effort to do that it comes to the front, is the fact they talk of the same principles of nature. And what I miss very often, certainly nowadays, also in osteopathy, is that people, whether they work or whether they study or whether they investigate things scientifically, is that they become, how should I say that, almost so tunnel visioned, yeah, by not regarding, not almost, I would say, not respecting, for instance, the principles of nature. And for me and my friend Max, this is one of the reasons why we, for instance, began with Morphologicum so many years ago. Prior to 2015, we had another name, but that's not important. But we created this platform, not to talk about osteopathy like a symptom or a technique, but to talk about osteopathy by its principles of nature. And these principles of nature, I hope really, and this is one of my concerns where I hope that I succeeded in the book, is that people who read the book will understand that these principles are already present since about 13.8 billion years, and they have not changed. The only thing that really has changed over time is how people look at phenomena, how people look at form, yeah, from a different angle, yeah, which is in fact nothing else as another expression of that very, very same principle. So the knowledge that Still had, no, I have to say it differently, the knowledge that Still gained in his time, yeah, and the knowledge that he had when he talked about osteopathy, the gained knowledge was what? The knowledge of the principles of nature, and they are exactly the same today. So they have not changed. The only thing is what science does is, what science should do, because they don't always do that, is apply them in that context. So what they do is they describe phenomena, but now maybe I am kicking against some knees or whatever. I don't care. But by the way, okay, what they do is describe it as a phenomenon, but no context. Yeah, if you say that you are going to change the form of a cell, for instance, of course, at that moment when the form of the cell or of the tissue or of the organ or of the organism, I don't care, because that principle is valid in all dimensions. That is why we talk about universal principles. If you change that form, of course the function will change. But before you can understand how come that the function also changes, Bruno, you must know what is the principle behind the form. Yeah, it's nice to say, oh yeah, form and function are a unity. What everybody says in osteopathy, blah 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 blah. Okay, and when you ask them then, and what do you mean? The big science comes. Yeah, but this because no, it's not because they're unity that you can say why does it change. And then you see, and this is what Still tried to do with his philosophy. This is what Blechschmidt did with his philosophy. This is what I tried to do by unifying them in the book, so to speak, is to show people what is it? Why does the function change when the form changes? What's the principle behind it? And then we come to very basic principles like, what is a form? Well, a form is a consequence. A consequence of what? A form is a consequence of structural components, and then it comes with Still emphasizes so much, as well as I in my book, not only is it a matter of structural components that plays a role, but also the fact that they have a very specific positional relationship. And if osteopaths don't understand that, well, then I'm wondering, what are they doing in their practice? Because that is one of the most fundamental principles of nature. And it's a universal principle, Bruno, because you see it in all dimensions. So this principle can be used by a scientist in cytology, or a scientist in histology, or a scientist in physiology, or a scientist in no matter what dimension. What they do know, or what they do gain, yeah, is insight, not new knowledge. Is insight about the fact that this principle at all times is the same. Is this new knowledge? No, this is, I would rather say, it's more emphasizing, underlining, confirming once more, yeah, the importance of understand the principles. And then the phenomenon becomes much easier to understand. One of the things that you see very often in scientific studies, with all due respect for the people who do that, don't get me wrong, is, well, we have found this, we can conclude this, but we also have many questions, so further investigation must be done. Read any scientific article, and that's the last sentence you read. Further, more investigation must be done. Yeah, when these people would look more into the principles, I think many of their questions are answered by themselves, by what they find. And this is, I think, one of the big issues, and now I talk as an osteopath, in our osteopathic community. I began to teach in 1994 as an osteopath in an osteopathic college, and I did that till 2000, but after that I left that college and I became an independent teacher, so to speak, for postgraduates. So I followed it up over the years, okay, till mid of the 20s, so 2008, 2010, around that time. And what you see, unfortunately, is the mainstream of how they create so-called osteopaths is far, far, far away from Still's principles. And mainly because what should I say that? There are two aspects to the story. That the fact that anatomy is not being taught anymore like it used to be in the days I was a student. Yeah, you see a change in the curriculum. But also what you see is that the emphasis on knowledge is changing. This is also one of the reasons why I wrote this book, not because I know I have the knowledge. Don't get me wrong, that's not my attitude. But this is a knowledge for practice. This book is not a theory book. This is a practical book, if you understand and can apply it. So it's not about the techniques for the symptoms. I always say I am a simple osteopath, Bruno. I only know 2 techniques. I only know 2 techniques. Either I go along or I go in the opposite direction. Yeah. And this principle was taught to me by the old osteopaths. I had the luck, together with my friend, to see some of the old dinosaurs of osteopaths who are now in their 90s or even dead by now. And what you see is when they were teaching us, they talked about the principles, and you can only do a correction, if I may say so, of a pattern of strain is either by going along or go in the opposite direction. And how you do that is not by learning some hand folding technique in a specific way. No, you apply it by your knowledge of anatomy. And those who have read Still's work, you know, he used this term very often, living picture of anatomy. Yeah, so what does he mean by that? Well, you need to have a very vivid 3-dimensional picture of anatomy in front of you when you work. And this is also why when I began to write the book, already before I began to write the book, I draw a lot. I did, beside my studies in secondary school, also art school. So I'm quite familiar with 3-dimensional looking and drawing and presenting it. So this is why I was so convinced that if I would ever write this book, I had to make the pictures myself all over again. Yeah, not only because I wanted to show them 3-dimensionally, but also I wanted to add information to the pictures in form of patterns. What Still talks about these patterns? But how can you explain to somebody what a pattern is? With all due respect, a young osteopath, how can you explain him or her what a pattern is if they don't have the building stones to make that pattern, if they don't have the sufficient anatomy knowledge? And this is something what worries me in a certain way, and this is not a critic to the individual who studies, it is more a critic to the schools and the colleges where osteopathy is being taught, that they don't put their emphasis anymore on that. For them, it's technique, and I have a huge problem with that. Because what technique is useful if you don't understand why you are applying it and on what you are applying it? And again, this book, I always was convinced I'm going to write it in 4 major parts. It's also how I teach it all over the world, in 4 major parts. And that is the part before you have really the tissues and the organs. And then I subdivided it to its chronology, very important. The book is built up really in chronological order from A to Z, from all the steps, one after the other. And you see that, for instance, that in that chronology, that certain organs appear before other organs and that they have consequences. And then I think it must have been somewhere around, I think, almost Christmas last year. So November, December last year, I was almost ready with my 4th part and all the drawings. I was really happy with that. And I said, I can't leave it like that. I can't leave it like that. I have to add a 5th part. Yeah. And I also teach a 5th part. I teach it also applied, hands-on in practice. But the condition that you can subscribe for that 5th part in teaching form is that you need to have done the first 4 parts first. Not so much because I like to gain money. Okay, everybody likes to gain money, but that's not my interest to say, oh, yeah, you cannot come to the seminar because you have not done A, B, C, and D. So you have to first pay for that and then you can come. No, the thing is, I can only work with colleagues, with young colleagues, in that practical hands-on if they have the basic steps of understanding the principles, yeah, and how to apply that. And so I added the 5th part also to the book, where I show the principles, the guidelines, if you want to, how Still talked about it, how even Blechschmidt talks about that, because that's important. What Blechschmidt describes in the human ontogenesis, yeah, the development of the human being from one cell to a complete individual, being the newborn, what he says and emphasizes, the story there does not end with birth, he says. This whole concept, the whole idea of morphodynamics and morphokinetics continues to go on long after birth, even more. It even goes on in your own body after you have died. And so if you say the circle is round, yeah, for me in a certain way, because you start with energy, you become a molecule, you become a cell, you become a tissue, you become an organ, you become an organism, and by the day that you die, well, the organism becomes a tissue and a cell and a molecule, and in the end, what leaves is energy. So in fact, you go back to where you came from in the end.
Yes.
And this is so nice. What I hope that in that 5th part of the book, that this also gives the people an insight that if they truly want to understand really why the patient is facing this problem, okay, and it's not because you have some so-called dysfunction, because Still never talked about dysfunction, you only talked about function, but okay, what's in a word? If the patient has this issue with his or her health, that you first try to understand what is going on here. And the simplified shortcut symptom dysfunction technique, that's not osteopathy. Okay, so and that is also something that I hope that I can somehow keep alive with this book. But then again, on the other hand, this book is not only written for osteopaths. Yeah, I mean, even a teacher in biology or a teacher of anatomy or a teacher, I don't know, people who are busy with, who are concerned and busy with the human form as a whole, well, for them, I hope this book can bring them some inspiration.
Yeah, for sure. And I just want to say something before. I didn't mean. I mean, I'm fully on board on what you said, and it's inspiring what you said actually. And I can see clearly what you're saying, and I agree. Before I didn't mean like in the 19th century they didn't know much. That's not, I didn't mean by they don't know much. What I was trying to convey is in these days we have a set of tools that are available and they were not available. So in the early days, let's say, or in the 19th century, the process of gathering knowledge was more, let's say, especially around these topics, was more was very philosophical, was very much of insights, of thinking and relating, and now to see that knowledge, to see those inputs, to see that you know, being somehow more observational now, more observed now with the scientific tools that we have available now. And it's almost like this constant dance between philosophy and science meaning scientific tools, and throughout life, in so many spheres of life, you can see this both dancing, you know, where and osteopathy, I think it's a big very good example of that. is where, and that's why some people call it an art and a philosophy, and also a science and a philosophy and an art. It's the meeting of these two. And what I was trying to convey is, in the 19th century, we didn't have so many things available, but we're already, you know, Andros Celestil as an example is already dwelling with all this kind of more philosophical part of it, and I think you would really appreciate living in this century. We have different tools to assess, but even then we don't need those tools.
May I interrupt you on that? Yeah. On that point, because it just struck my mind. It came by. Let's take the heart. Yeah, let's take the heart and form and function and what we know about this today. To begin with, our understanding of the heart today, with all the knowledge, with all the knowledge that we have, with all the tools that we use, are you aware of the fact, most likely not, but are you aware of the fact that this is all wrong? What do I mean by that? The knowledge they had in the 5th century before Christ, the knowledge and the understanding about the heart in the 5th century before Christ was more accurate than the knowledge that we have about the heart, form and function today. This is no joke. There are enough articles, scientific articles from people who've done scientific research on the heart that come to the conclusion that our understanding of the heart, with all the details about the circulation, the innervation, the chemistry of the heart, and so on, is inaccurate. This is one of the schisma, or what should I say, one of the big topics in our, certainly our society today, is from, they always talk about philosophy and science. No, you can't do that, Bruno. Why? For the very simple reason, philosophy is the first science. Philosophy is science. You don't have philosophy and science. No. Sorry, I don't agree with that. And I have sufficient arguments to show you that they are both sciences, but science, what we call today science, is a numeric science, is science based on numbers, while philosophy is a science based on syllogism. And these are two different words. You can't compare them as such. So, and even more, if you look into the chronology, the history of our science in Western world, all the principles, all the basics of what we call science by using numbers comes from the set of rules, from philosophy. Rhetorics, logica, rhetorica, grammatica. And you find that back in the methodology of today. But each time you talk about philosophy, oh no, that's not science, that's something else. No, 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 no. So be careful when you say that today we have more tools. Yes. Today we know more details. Yes. But what are you with all these tools and all these details if you don't put it in a framework of philosophy, of reasoning? And this is also going on in osteopathy. Everything today must be evidence-based. So put into numbers, which is fine by me, so to speak. But what are you with all these evidence-based put in numbers to prove that it works if you don't have a concept? If you don't have a framework? And this is what Still provided. This is what Blechschmidt provided. This is what I tried to make clear in a red line in the book, is from, this is the context that you put it in. Okay, you can look at the heart, to take that one. You can look at the heart in its form and function in dimension of a molecule. You can see it in the dimension of a cell, tissue as an organ, and even in an organism. But without the context, all these details of knowledge have no meaning. That's one of the big, to my opinion, one of the big problems that we have, what we are facing in our society. There are even in Europe, I'm not going to call names because that makes no sense or has no meaning as such, but today, if you have postgraduate courses who have to become accredited to get points for your whatever insurance company and blah, 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 okay, today, as soon as you hear that the course is a philosophical course, they say, oh no, that's not scientific. Excuse me, philosophy is the purest science of all. And this is also something that I try to make obvious in the book. From guys, science as such, and girls, of course, science as such, whether you talk about philosophy, the syllogistic science, or the science of the numeric science, the science of the numbers, okay, it's about reasoning. And how you reason, in what way. And don't forget, that is also something that Still wrote in his books more than once. Osteopathy is about reasoning. And if you don't have anatomical knowledge, you have nothing to reason from, he says. This is a painful, how should I say, painful quote that comes from him, because it means the less anatomy the people have in the practice, the less they behave themselves as osteopaths, according to Still. So detailed knowledge, I agree, we have more possibilities, okay, to understand certain phenomena in detail. But again, if you don't put them in a framework,
yeah,
little to no meaning.
Yeah, that's the dance I was referring to. Is like more the scientific, let's say, a scientific method. Let's just say, bear with me, it's just a little bit. Scientific method uses certain materials and certain methodology to study a specific phenomenon, and then very much comes to the conclusion there needs more research, as you said. And then, but to put that in the frame, it's the like kind of the reasoning or the philosophical part of it, which we differentiate, just I guess, just to put things into a more boxes and what but I was referring to that dance between one and the other are the same, or they're interconnected to really understand maybe much better a phenomenon. I think I'm making some sense. I'm not sure, but anyways, I would just like to ask one last question, because you know, I invited you to come on the show, but I don't want to take too much of your time. It's already
No problem,
50 minutes. I think you touched a bit on the subject, but I would like to hear your thoughts, because you obviously been thinking about this for this stuff for decades, and I think it's fascinating topics. Again, we can't isolate the human being into a set of organs and muscles and just a form and take him out of, you know, it's not just a bunch of bones and organs, and we do that a lot. We simplify that a lot when we assess the human being, when we treat the human being. And what is I mean, have you considered, in terms of in introspection, what is the purpose of life? What's the purpose? What's the meaning of life? The meaning of a human being? The meaning of where do we kind of how do we fit into? I mean, I know personally how do I take those things into my own beliefs and my own experiences in my own life, but my own beliefs are not like a general thing. So how do we, in our practice, in our profession, let's say, where is the room for spirituality, as Andrew Still also said, this interconnection between mind, body, and spirit, and with that, we also touch into the meaning of to the meaning of life. You referred in the past energy, and what is that specifically? And do you have any thoughts about it? Or
Yes. Yes. Do you have 2 more hours left for me?
Yeah.
No, because I will gladly answer that question, but it is not so. The time required to ask the question is much less than to answer it.
Okay.
First of all, what's the meaning of life? I will make it very short. There is no meaning. For a simple reason, if you look at life as a expression of function, yeah, life as an expression of how a form behaves, okay, it's simple for me. Form is a consequence, just as much as a function a consequence is. A function is a consequence based on the form and the interaction with its environment. So this brings us very far, and I think those, maybe if you read that book, you don't have to read this book to understand maybe the answers to it, but if you read the book, you might find the answer to that. Meaning, again, there is only a meaning to it if you give it yourself a meaning. For me, it's a consequence. Why? Every form, listen, this is for me really a fundamental principle. For everybody says form and function are a unity. Okay, which means if they are a unity, that all the definitions and all the principles, all the characteristics that can be described for a form are also valid to describe for a function. If A equals B and B equals C, well, Logica says A equals C. So every principle for form gives us an insight of what function not only can be, but what function is. Life as a verb, you can describe life as a function, as a behavior, as an expression of the interaction between form and environment. Which means you talk about spirituality. We talk about in our course about spirituality, but not before 5 years going to all the single steps of human being. Why, Bruno? If we talk about, for instance, spirituality, mind, and so on, then we talk about a dimension of the highest level of complexity within the human form. Which means before you can start to define what is spirituality, what is mind, what is religion, and so on, you need to understand what is the form, okay, that expresses this kind of behavior. And now it comes. To understand that function, you need to understand that form, and to understand that form, you need to know all the dimensions underneath. Why? A form, a human organism, is the consequence of all of its organs. These organs are the consequence of all their tissues, and go on. So before you can go to the level of complexity of what is called reasoning, thinking, spirituality, religion, politics, and so on, consciousness, yeah, you need to go that deep, that far, because every single step has a meaning. Every single step has a meaning in that process of becoming that form. Yeah? The origin and the nature of becoming a human form. We are not humans when we are born. We are a single cell. We have some characteristics, yeah, which are inherent to that cell form. And from that cell form, that human cell form, there will be no frog, and there will be, I agree. So there is a kind of common characteristic, but how it expresses itself in higher levels of complexity, in higher and in larger dimensions, to understand that we need to go all the road. And this is something also in practice very, very important that young osteopaths should understand. And when I work with younger generations, because I still do some work with them in practice, you see the eye opener. Yeah, I give you an example. Somebody comes in, and the patient, and it says, "Oh, I have low back pain." Yeah, the shortcut is what today? Let's be honest. Low back pain, lumbar 5 dysfunction. That's a technique. Yeah, that's the shortcut today. Where I say, wait a minute. Yeah, that lumbar region has bones and muscles and fascias and nerves and blood vessels and so on. So maybe it's not the bone, maybe it's the fascia, maybe it's the muscle, maybe it's the blood vessel, maybe it is the nerve who is in trouble. So how are you going to treat that problem of the patient if you if you're not aware of the fact which of the structural components of what is called lumbar pain is here under strain? Yeah, so which means also for this higher level, somebody comes in with a emotional problem, with a psychological problem, with a social problem, I don't know, so another symptom. Okay, what does it still say? Symptoms are merely effects. Effect of what? Okay, it talks about the pattern of strain. Okay, but where do we locate that? So if we want to talk about the dimension of, for instance, where we have spirituality, we can discuss it under one condition, that you understand the whole road that brought you to a form that is able to have the behavior of spirituality, to have the behavior of social contact and so on. Yeah, do you understand this?
Yes, I understand. I understand, and I understand why.
For example, another anorexia. Take anorexia. Yeah, so the mind is not going well, according to psychology. Yeah, very nice, very nice. So we put them in psychotherapy and so on and so on. Now, what you see is, for instance, that in Sweden, in the Karolinska Institute, okay, they say, all the psychology, wait a second. First of all, you are going to eat. No, I don't want to eat. Well, you have to eat. And if you don't eat, we put you a Baxter and we feed you by that way. Period. First, the food. Why? How can you expect the brain to behave, yeah, if its structures don't get the nutrients to behave as a whole? You see? So sometimes you can say, yeah, the problem is in that dimension, the brain. But very often what you see also in practice for a lumbar pain or a headache or a shoulder pain or diarrhea, that the dimension in which you have to locate the source that causes the effect, the symptom, okay, that you figure out where is that source, in what dimension do you have that? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And this is what I try. This is also slightly touched in the fifth part. You can go beyond the dimension of the human as a whole in a material form. You can go to a more non-graspable form where we talk about psychology, sociology, yeah, spirituality. Okay, but again, before you can answer that question, we need to know, do we talk the same language? And now it comes also, and really it gets on my nerves, sorry that I say that, but when you look at the choices of the words that's still used in his days, yeah, the first question that you have to ask yourself is the same content given to the word today as in those days? Yeah, my dear friend Max, for instance, he kept himself busy for quite a long time, okay, with Webster's dictionary, the book that still had, the vocabulary book, that the dictionary that still had, to see, hey, when he says mind, okay, how was mind defined in the 19th century, and how is mind defined today? And what you see is they don't talk about the same. if I take another example, more contemporary, because it's a modern word since about 5 to 10 years in osteopathy. Oh, we are going to talk about fluids in osteopathy. I am a fluidic osteopath. And then when I start to discuss, don't laugh, okay? I mean, you can work on fluids as an osteopath.
Oh yes, I know.
But now, when you talk about these people, and with all due respect, and you ask them, and what is for you a fluid? Then you say, from what star or planet in the universe are they coming? Because this is not the definition of a fluid. Never was and never will be. Never was, never is, and never will be. So I want to talk about you about spirituality. Yeah, why not? But then we have to shut down the camera, okay? Take an afternoon, day off, and first establish, Bruno, what do you mean by spirituality? What is the definition that you use? And what is the definition that I use? And then is the question, what definition did Still use? And then compare. Are we talking about the same to begin with? And then we come to one conclusion, that is clear, okay? It's a behavior. And this behavior is a consequence of form and its relationship with its environment. So, which means that, for instance, when we talk about spirituality as a behavior, as a consequence of the relationship with my environment, well, I will fill in this spirituality in a different way as an Eskimo, okay, living on the North Pole, or somebody in the bushes of Africa. Yeah, okay, we are all humans. I agree. We are all humans. And we have similar, analogies, homologies, and form and function. Okay, but still, what makes us human is partially defined by our environment. Yeah, we are all osteopaths. Yeah, we are all calling ourselves osteopaths. You live in, I think it's in Portugal. I live in Belgium. Another friend lives just over the river in the Netherlands or in Germany. Yeah, we are all called osteopath DO, but what defines us as an osteopath is also complex, because we have different nationalities, different mentalities, and even more and more important, what we have, unfortunately, different schools with different standards, with different curricula. So what defines us as an osteopath? It's a complex story. And what we make out of osteopathy should be the same if we follow the principles of nature, if we follow still how he looks at it. That's not the case. It's not the case, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would agree. And
so if you ask me, what's the meaning of life? Well, the meaning of life is what you make out of it for yourself in your relationship to your environment. But for me, in its essence, there is no meaning. There's only consequence. I don't think that you saw that coming.
No. As you said, we needed a whole afternoon. It's yeah. We could talk about this for hours and hours, but it's still kind of poetic what you said. There's no meaning. There's consequences, and I think that says a lot. But you also bring us back also to the origins of everything, and how form started. At least for me, that's what I. But yeah, my question was really it was a very vague question, and it's a question I usually I ask. It's more to feel, or to feel what other people perceive as the dimensions of the human being, which for me it's far beyond just the material and the form. And how does that actually, if it does, relates to how does that relate to practice, and how does the and it was but it's very complex too.
It is, but then again, Bruno, you require a knowledge, and moreover, not only knowledge but also an insight in what I call the level of complexity. And now let me please allow me briefly to define what I mean with complexity, because that is also quite easy to misunderstand. When I say that something is complex, and you find it also in the book, I don't mean that it is difficult. Yeah, if I use the word, oh, that's complex, then people think, oh, what he means is, oh, this is difficult. No, no, no. The word, the meaning of the word, that's explained also in the book, of complexity, something is complex, something has a level of complexity, means that you have a number of relationships between certain components in a form. Yeah? And this is what defines not only the form, but also the function of that form, this relationship between these structural components. Yeah? This is what defines how that form will respond to, in the interaction with the environment. This is one of the big issues that happened in 1953? I think it's 1953. So I don't hope that they will now shoot me if I got the date wrong. But I think it's 1953. You have this famous the Kirksville Consensus Declaration, yeah, where these great eminences, with all due respect, came together to define what is osteopath, what is osteopathy. So it happened after Still had died. I think it's 1953. But anyhow, then you see what they define as the 4 key principle, yeah, which means the body is a unity and blah, 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 and body, mind, and spirit. And then we have the thing that structure and function are interdependent. And then we say, okay, the third principle is that the body is capable of self-regulation, self-maintenance, self-healing, and so on. And the fourth principle is that osteopathy is in fact based on a full understanding of the first 3 principles. This is in shortcut now what was a consensus in 1953. And there you see, for instance, this is one of the biggest error that we can see in osteopathy, is the fact that they talk about structure and function. Yeah? I had with, I think it was a Spanish osteopath a couple of days ago, a small disagreement on that on Facebook. I cut out because it's not a medium to discuss such thing. But anyhow, they talk so often about structure and function, still never did that, eh? So I hope that all the listeners who will listen in the future hear me again. I will repeat it. Still never talked about structure and function. He always talked about form and function. So there is a difference in meaning between these words. And the meaning is that form is defined as a consequence by its structures, not vice versa.
Can you say that? Can you say that again? Can you say that?
So Still never talked about structure and function. He always talked about form and function. Now, when you look into his writings, how he looks at form and how he describes form and its function, what you see is you come to the conclusion that form is defined by the consequence of its structures and their positional relationship, which means if you want to understand that function, you need to understand that form. And if you want to understand that form, you must know which structures are involved. This is why I talked about that last weekend with a group of osteopaths from different countries. I said, listen, if you talk about form, if you see a patient as a form, you need to see that patient always in 2 dimensions at the same time. And then they said, I don't understand that. Well, let me explain. Yeah. If you look at the person as a whole, let's say his spine, yeah, you look at the spine as a form. How can you understand the form of that spine if you don't see, for instance, the vertebra? These are the structural components. So why do you have a straight vertebra and why do you have a scoliosis? Why do you have a straight spine and why do you have a scoliosis spine? Yeah, You see the form, but how is this form defined? Well, it is defined and determined by its structures. For instance, the bones, the individual vertebra, which are part of that form, the spine, but also by their positional relationship. And now I talk about a very easy example, because you also have, of course, the muscles, and you can use the nerves, and you can use the fascias, and even for other parts of the body, you can do the same exercise. So again, if you want to understand this form, you need to look into that form in two adjacent dimensions at the same time as an osteopath: the form and the underlying dimension of its structures. Only then you can understand why, and only then you can understand why this form behaves in a patient differently. The only reason why somebody comes with a symptom is because his function has changed. His function has changed, we call a symptom now, is because the form has changed. And this form has changed because the structural components and their positional relations have changed. But if you don't know your anatomy in all dimensions, up until the molecules, how can you then know in what dimension your source for the change is located? You can't. So again, coming again to your word of spirituality or emotionality or psychology, yeah, this is a very high level of complexity. Yeah, this is not physical, apparently not physical graspable anymore. Yeah, but as long as you don't understand in the underlying dimension, how does his brain look alike? How does his head look alike? How does his head and spine look alike? So you create a kind of, yeah, package around it. If you don't understand that, you don't understand why it's behaving like that. I mean, if you are one day you are angry and naughty and grumpy, yeah, that is your emotional state. Okay, why can it be? Well, it can be maybe because your wife is nagging at your head again. I don't know, but for the same price, yeah, you have somewhere an issue in your stomach. You don't feel good in your stomach. Now make the connection between that stomach that's not going well and your grumpiness. These requires a lot of steps in between. You understand?
Yeah.
I work with two psychologists. I work with them. I used to work with three, but one died because he fell off a mountain. No joke.
Wow.
But I really. But I work, for instance, with two psychologists. One is a psychiater. So he's a doctor. He's an MD. Okay, who works with medication, chemical. And another is the other two were psychotherapists who talk, who do gestalt therapy and so on. So they work non-medical. And from time to time, I get a patient, yeah, and then they say, well, we have a problem. We can't get any further. Can you look into it? So, well, I look. And what you often see is then that the problem, the issue with the person, yeah, the symptom is an effect, yeah. But in this case, the symptom is an effect not of a non-graspable strain. For instance, daddy issues, mommy issues, or girlfriend issues, yeah, but a physical issue. So then they come to me, and if I find then that physical issue being a strain, I treat that. And then you see the patient goes back to the psychotherapist, and it goes further. They can go on in their therapy. And sometimes I have a patient. I take the example of an older lady. She was in her 50s in those days. She came to me with low back pain. And I can tell you, Bruno, after 2-3 treatments, nothing changed. I said, damn it, either I am blind and I don't see it, or the strain that the person is undergoing, yeah, coming from the environment, is not located in the physical form of that person. So I said to the lady, listen, I think that this and this and this might be the problem. I'm not sure, but I can't find anything that is related to. So I think your issue, your strain, is another dimension, another level of complexity. If I were you, okay, I would look into it and go to a
Psychotherapist.
Psychotherapist. And it was nice to see. I didn't see her for almost a year. And then I met her in the street here in town, and she said, well, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. I said, what? I said, oh, well, I went to that lady for the treatment, and indeed, a lot of strain came out of the therapy, but it was present in a non-graspable level of complexity, which is outside of my influence, so to speak, in that case. So again, one of the biggest challenges, if I may say so, as an osteopath, is to figure out in what anatomical dimension do I have that strain that causes that effect. And now this is why I think the book can be helpful for many or some of my colleagues, because in the book you see that the majority of patterns in our patients are resulting from developmental patterns, with not a negative way. Yeah, don't understand me wrong. Yeah, it's not because you have headache because something went wrong in the development of your head. No, that's not the case. What you see is, and this is also a fundamental principle in our work, I think, as an osteopath. When you develop as a human, Bruno, you start with a molecule, and the molecule becomes a structural component of a cell. And the cells, as a form, okay, they become the structural components to a tissue, and go on. And now it comes. One of the questions for me was, in my studies over the year, what defines that this cell is going to sit there and that cell is going to sit there? Why not vice versa? Yeah? Why is your head up and not down? Okay? Why are your elbows here and not somewhere else? And so on. So why are the organs located in a position as they are in humans? And then you see in the study of the morphodynamics and morphokinetics that due to the environmental conditions, these structural components receive a very well-defined position by a pattern, by a kind of movement from here to there under the influence of something. So in fact, if you come to this world, what characterizes you? You have a head and you have a trunk, okay, and you have a liver and a stomach and muscles, okay. But what also defines you is how they are positionally related. I always emphasize people when they study anatomy, don't learn the words by heart. That's something we can use when we communicate. But when you practice, what you have to know is look at how they are related, aligned in space. Recognize the patterns. I take an example. Pectoralis major, intercostalis externus, intercostalis internus, abdominalis, and you see a pattern of strain. The muscle fibers are aligned in space. Yes, they have different names, Bruno, but they are one pattern, which means, and now it comes, when you are in later life encountering a strain, what will your body do? It will use these patterns to find the way out of the strain. Yeah? And now comes the patient to us and says, I have a neck pain. You have a neck pain? Yeah. But the problem is, a month ago, okay, somebody kicked on your hip or you fell down and you fell on your pelvis. And this caused a strain that extends by this pattern up until your neck. With other words, do you have a problem with your neck? No. Do you have a problem with a strain? And that strain goes from your left hip up until your neck on the right side. But if you, again, if you don't know your anatomy, you will hammer and treat that neck, but not the pattern of strain.
Yeah.
And that is what I try in my book to explain, and why I use all these drawings here to show these patterns, because they are imprinted in our form.
Fascinating stuff. Very, very interesting. I can't wait to read the book, honestly. And thank you so much for. I could talk to you the whole day, but I don't know. It was very, very interesting. It was fascinating. Like I said, I mean, I could spend the whole afternoon talking and asking questions and dwelling on this. I think it makes perfect sense. Thank you for writing this book, because it's one thing I enjoy about these talks and online talks and this YouTube, and it's this timeless. It's just out there, and there's no time, and someone can watch this talk in 10, 20 years time, and
long after I'm gone.
Yeah, and the book is the same. So so thank you so much, Jean Paul, for coming. Maybe you can come to Portugal maybe next year and give a on-site talk about this, maybe even a course, but we'll talk later. Despeço-me até ao próximo podcast. Obrigado pela vossa presença, espero que tenham gostado e até breve.